We have several important stories tonight and a fact check later on a new political effort to minimize white supremacy in America. And we begin, however, with this controversy greeting the president. At this hour, Donald Trump's in El Paso. He's visiting victims of this weekend's deadly shooting, the second of two grieving cities that he visited today. In both, huge outcries from many people, a plea that Donald Trump simply stay away so they could mourn without his attacks, without his bickering, without his tweeting feuds that use even a mass shooting, even this horror, as a kind of a backdrop for more political Twitter Trumpism. Let me read to you a somber account. This was the lead in today's New York Times, telling you that your president began a day set aside for healing by delivering a series of political grievances against liberals and the media, once again using Twitter to exhibit the divisive language that's prompted some in El Paso and Dayton, Ohio, to protest his visits after horrific shootings in these cities. This is a time that Americans know is not normal. And as citizens confront these worst of horrors, we have to note that many, and not just resistance folks, but many across the ideological spectrum here, felt that if the president is going to break all decorum and rules, then they will break with some decorum too. Because look, let's be clear. We can use clarity at times like this, if nothing else. Before Donald Trump, it was a widely held nonpartisan tradition to welcome a president to any town, any place, any community rocked by this kind of murderous tragedy. But these citizens were basically warning that Trump won't provide comfort, and they know that because of his actions. Well, he's now spent the last 24 hours careening from one controversy to another, proving his naysayers right. Protesters on the ground in both Dayton, Ohio, and El Paso, Texas today, demonstrating against these visits, while Trump continued to do all sorts of Trump stuff, attacking Beto O'Rourke, the New York Times, the Democrats, and yes, why not throw in the mayor of one of the cities he's visiting, all while claiming with this empty rhetoric, he's there to bring people together.
What do you say to your critics that believe it's your rhetoric that is emboldening white nationalists and inspiring this anger?
So my critics are political people. They're trying to make points. In many cases, they're running for president, and they're very low in the polls. I think my rhetoric is it brings people together.
It brings people together. This may be Trump trolling, knowing that neither his supporters think that that's his brand, his expectation, his priority, and certainly he knows his critics don't view him that way. But again, I just mentioned and reported some of what he's done. Then take this, which you may not have heard about yet since it's brand new. He goes to Ohio and then picks a new fight with someone who's not running for president, who didn't set out to battle with him, Ohio Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown, who actually went out of his way in, yes, unity to go with Donald Trump to the hospital.
He was comforting, and he did the right things, and Melania did the right things, and it's his job in part to comfort people. People at the hospital were terrific, and people showed, when the President of the United States came, they showed respect for the office, and a number of them said to me they're not great admirers of him privately, but they clearly showed respect for the office because the President of the United States is in town.
What did you just witness? Why is that even at the top of a newscast? What you just saw looks straightforward, to the point of normal, to the point of what some might call routine. A senator telling everyone the president did what he was supposed to do. The reason we have to play that is so you have the context for this. President Trump lashing out and saying that Brown, who you just saw there basically give him some decent words, was misrepresenting the visit, and that news conference, which we just showed you so you have the facts, itself was some sort of, quote, fraud. That is what had people turning out in 100-degree heat to tell Trump he wasn't welcome in El Paso.
Trump is responsible, and he is part of the problem. He is not welcome.
We live in a country where we have a president who demonizes communities like this one, who vilifies immigrants.
There have been words that have been powerful and painful and full of hate and full of bigotry and full of racism.
El Paso, I am proud of you. El Paso, I love you. El Paso, we are bigger and better and greater than this.
That's part of the scene playing out tonight. Donald Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric and tendency to abuse rather than use these kind of ceremonial appearances is well known. But this week's tragedy is also putting new scrutiny on Trump administration actions that may be somewhat less well known to many, and which Donald Trump has actually been minimizing as he claims today he might be open to some sort of new background checks law. Consider this fact check. You're about to see the categories of dangerous gun buyers that now have an easier time getting guns because of tweaks by the Trump administration of federal rules. People with mental disabilities, fugitives, foreign buyers, all can get guns easier under changes by the Trump administration. Some parts of the gun debate are complex, as we've covered. They touch on issues that implicate the Constitution, civil liberties, people's right to have something to defend themselves. Other parts are pretty simple. Making it easier for fugitives to get their hands on guns is one of the dumbest, most dangerous policy changes the government can make. And under Trump, getting new scrutiny tonight, that's exactly what your government did. Before I turn to a wider panel tonight with special coverage from El Paso, I'm joined right here in New York by Paola Ramos, a former campaign aide to Hillary Clinton and host of Vice's Latinx, who's very conversant with how we got here. Thanks for joining me.
Of course.
I wanted to delve into what we just saw there, your view of something that I don't think even opponents of Donald Trump can take much pride in, which is organizing against what would be a normal ceremonial visit by a president.
Yes.
I'm sure you would welcome certain Republican presidents, even if you had disagreements with them. You've run against Republicans, but there are Republicans who could come mourn with you, yes?
Absolutely.
What is the difference here, and what do you think is important about it?
The difference here, especially as we see those images of the president walking down the stair into El Paso, the difference there is that there are a lot of people on both sides of the party that are seeing someone that is walking into his own crime scene. I believe that he is someone that is walking into this crime scene and with bloods in his hand, right? And I say that because he has literally transformed El Paso, one of the most beautiful cities in this country, one of the most safest cities in this country, into a battlefield. Why? Because every time that he has used the word invasion, he has implicitly entitled his base, white supremacists, to attack us. So that is why what we're seeing on these images, what we're seeing on the screen is not normal. Because a lot of people see someone that is literally walking into the own mess, the own crime, the own slaughterhouse that he has created.
Here he was today when asked about this and the embrace of some of these groups. Take a look.
I am concerned about the rise of any group of hate. I don't like it. Any group of hate. I am, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's any other kind of supremacy, whether it's Antifa, whether it's any group of hate, I am very concerned about it.
I don't think I have to say anything. I think it's very clear that he is lying. And I also do want to point out that as he is in El Paso, right, talking to these families, the largest ICE raid in the last 10 years is taking place right now. Just took place in Mississippi. So he can show up, he can denounce hate, he can denounce white supremacists. He also, as he is doing all of this, just enacted one of the largest raids that we have seen in this country. So he is, in my eyes, and in many people's eyes, and the victims' eyes, a traitor.
Paola, stay with me. I now want to broaden this discussion and bring in Christina Greer, a friend of the show, political science professor at Fordham, Margaret Carlson, columnist for The Daily Beast, and from El Paso, Maria Hinojosa, anchor and executive producer of NPR's Latino USA. Maria, what are you seeing down there? What's important based on your reporting?
You know, Ari, it's problematic only because we're spending so much time talking about 45 when there's a part of me that really would love to be talking about the people who lost their lives here, the Mexicans, the Mexican Americans, the other folks one German man who lost his life here. But we're talking about, the consequences of 45 coming down here. But here's what I will tell you. From my reporting, the sense is what I heard was somebody say, does he not think that we know exactly what he feels towards us, because what he has saying about us, he has been repeating since July of 2015. So the words that they used to say about this visit was insulted, and also that 45 was burlándose. It's a very Mexican word, that he was making fun of this situation because everybody knows, regardless of how people in mainstream media and fellow journalists manages, the people here know and feel that he doesn't like Mexicans. He doesn't like Mexican Americans. He doesn't like Latinos. He doesn't like immigrants. And so if he comes down here for whatever time, that doesn't make any of that go away. I also want to say that, we tried to get here. So many streets are blocked off. It's almost like there's an attempt to blockade people from actually coming out to the protest. Somebody else who from around here just said, if he really wanted to show respect to what happened here, the scene of this tragedy is right here. And he could have come here. He is the president. He could have come right there and stood there. And yet he stayed away because also behind me are the altars, are the protesters, and they didn't want him to see that. So people here on the ground are feeling that. And I think what's going to happen is that they will find, they're not going to come out and rally and protest because 45 is here. They're going to decide on their own terms the way people from El Paso are. And they're going to say, how are we going to decide? Will it be one day on a Sunday in the late evening when it's not, 105 degrees, when they come out dressed in white and take to the streets? That might be more their style, but it's going to be on their terms, not on another president's terms.
Talk to us a little bit more about that point, because this is, as you say, a community that knows very well that Donald Trump went there and called it an invasion, the military-esque rhetoric, used the State of the Union to present the city as falsely more dangerous than it is. All of this selective and sometimes blatantly lying invocation of risk that El Paso would pose towards everyone else. And here we are in a day when, during this powder keg, it is, as you pointed out, it is this community that it turns out was at risk of this this alleged murder. Legally, we call it that until the process plays out. But what looks like, to put it in layman's terms, what looks like a white supremacist murder. And I wonder about that, and if you could talk to us more through that as I play a little bit more of what we heard from some of the community that you've been reporting on, folks talking about why it wasn't right for Trump to come under these terms. Take a listen.
The other thing that I heard, Chris, totally unsolicited from victims still in the hospital, as they'd grab my arm and tell him not to come here.
It would be wonderful if he showed up and actually did do that and actually did apologize for the language that he's used, for the way that he's talked about immigrants. The problem is I don't think that he's capable of doing that.
Maria and then Christina.
So, Ari, look, I want to center kind of the humanity of this situation. I was in a funeral home yesterday with the family that lost their father. He was the last person to die, apparently. This is a man who, what he's learning, this is the son of the man who died, and what he said is, I want us all to look at each other. This is a very Mexican man. He lives in Mexico, even though he's a U.S. citizen, and he said, I want us to learn how to look at each other and to see ourselves in each other. I'm pointing this out because there's a level of kind of political awareness that's coming that maybe it's not manifested in terms of Republican or Democrat. But he was saying, when I have an African neighbor, he's me. When I have a Muslim neighbor, he's me. They're making these connections. And also, again, Ari, very surprising to me because I know this region well. More than once now, Latinos, Mexican Americans have brought up Puerto Rico. And they have brought up Trump in relation to Puerto Rico. And they're saying, we know what he did there, how he disrespected the people there. Now we're understanding that we have become a target because of his own words. We're making the connections. Now that is a political dynamic that is fascinating, right? Sadly, as a result of horrible tragedy.
Christina?
Well, I think picking up on Maria's thread, I mean, when we ask someone to see ourselves in them, I mean, that is not only picking up from Dr. Martin Luther King, that's also picking up from the Bible, which I think a lot of Americans fundamentally believe that there needs to be some sort of Christian ethic that is missing with this particular president. And we know that he is a coward. I mean, Paula sort of mentioned him having to come to the crime scene that he's created, but he's incapable of ever looking at anyone else's humanity and having empathy. We've seen that even on Twitter when he's en route from El Paso to Dayton, when he's on Air Force One and he's still tweeting about elected officials and making fun of people. So that's just not possible. And so I think, to really hit home what Maria was saying is, how do we then translate this and center it back to the people who are living in fear, not just because of ICE raids and immigration, but because it seems as though no one is safe in America, especially people of color, when the president fundamentally does not believe that any of us belong here and that we have rights to be citizens, documented or undocumented. And so I think for us now is, how do we translate this fear and this anger into a political power beyond just coalition building, but really paying attention to the Republican Party members who are enabling this president to not only have this rhetoric, but these dire consequences. And so we have 2020 coming up, and it's not just about removing the president from office, but making sure that the people who have been surrounding him, to Mitch McConnell and friends, making sure that, we don't have protective gun laws, that Puerto Rico doesn't get the funding that they need, that these ICE raids are fully funded. All of these policies that are affecting millions and millions of American men, women, and children, documented and non-documented, but people living in this country. I think that's the important piece where we have to channel some of these emotions, of which there are several. And unfortunately, we know, because the Republican Party has been so lax in actually putting forth policy, we do know that these things will happen again, and the fear will just continue to grow. I mean, the children that are growing up under this particular president will forever be changed because of the horrors that they've had to experience, not just in their own personal lives, but on television and social media constantly.
Margaret?
Ari, the clip you showed of the El Paso resident saying, well, maybe if he'd said he was sorry and he came, that would have been better, and there wouldn't have been so many who didn't want him to come. And she said, but he doesn't have that within him. He doesn't have it within him, of course. He can't even do that fake apology. I'm sorry if I caused you pain. I'm not that I'm sorry because I did. But he can't do it because, in fact, this is part of his platform going forward, which is to dehumanize immigrants and call them invaders that will sometimes inflame other people to shoot them. So he can't apologize because politically he can't do it.
Let me give you a little more grist for the point you're making, because I think what you're gesturing towards, Margaret, is the notion of a day of mourning, which is what it means to go visit these sites. There's no day off for him. Take a look here at a little bit more of his response when lightly pressed on some of this.
I think illegal immigration is a terrible thing for this country. I think you have to come in legally. Ideally, you have to come in through merit. We need people coming in because we have many companies coming into our country. They're pouring in. And I think illegal immigration is a very bad thing for our country.
Margaret, making light only of myself and not the day, may I ask you a stupid question?
Oh, please.
Was that the right emphasis as he prepared to embark to grieving El Paso today?
Almost every word out of his mouth in the White House driveway before he got onto Marine One was disgraceful and hurtful and a lie and spreading blame otherwise to Beto O'Rourke and Joe Biden. He practically blamed the Dayton shooting on Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders because the Dayton shooter had expressed admiration for them in some tweet or other, something they wrote. Well, if that's the case, then it means that he's responsible for the El Paso shooter, because that shooter actually quoted Donald Trump to the fact that he was incited to kill 22 people. And then the callousness of the first time his handlers let him out of their sight. He's not under wraps, and he gets on the plane at noon, and he tweets an insult to Joe Biden, saying how boring he is and how his ratings are down, which is the only thing Trump cares about, are ratings, as if he's still a reality star. What callousness in between 2 devastated cities, he's got to go on a rant off to the side. There was nothing sincere in what he did today. And in part, it's because he can't afford to be, because what's in his heart and what's in his brain in order to win the election is not something he can reveal on a day of mourning. But he will be back to revealing it any minute now.
Yeah, it's really something to take hold of. We dedicated a full 20 minutes to this opening report and conversation because it matters. I got to fit in a break now. Paolo Ramos, Christina Greer, Margaret Carlson, and Maria Hinojosa, thanks to each of you. We do appreciate it. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.